Hey everyone, and welcome to our lecture on creating users and groups. In this lecture, we're going to talk about how we can create new user accounts, how we can modify them after they've been created, how we can delete them, and then we'll talk about how we can create, modify, and delete groups as well. So to get started, before we create a user account, we need to decide on a group strategy. So there's two different group strategies. The user groups, which is what we have seen, where um, a new user account has a group created with their username, and that group is also that user's primary group. So in a previous lecture, we saw where I would log in with my user account Corey, and Corey would also be my primary group. Now, what that allows is I can get people added into that group, and they can have the ability to read and write to different files depending on how I set up the permissions. Now the alternative to that is project groups. So let's say that me, Alice, and Bob are going to work on a project together. Then we may create a separate group called Project X or whatever the project may be, and we would all be added as members to that group. And then any files that we create, we would give group permissions to those files so that we could all edit and work on those files together. Additionally, we also need to come up with a good password. And there's a few strategies we can use for coming up with a good password. One that the book talks about is to choose a base, so some sort of a base word or sentence, and then modify that base. So go in and change your numbers or some of the letters to numbers if you get into like hacker speak, where maybe the 5 is an S and the 4 is an A and 3 is an E and so on. You can also mix the case, so I definitely recommend having that done throughout. Do some capitals and some lower cases. You can reverse the letter order, add more words to it, add more letters, add numbers. Anything like that can help grow the haystack. Now, additionally, I also like to recommend that people consider using something like Password Manager. So I use one called KeyPass. And just to show you what that looks like, it looks something like this, where you create a password database. So this is the creation of a new password database. Let me just create one real quick. So in here you can organize all of your passwords based on different categories, or you can create new groups that the passwords can go in, so maybe one for CCU. And then if you need to create an account, what you do is you come in here and you go to new entry, and we can put in a new account. So maybe this will be for email at CCU. So if CA Nance is my username, I can generate a random password. All right, and the idea here is that we don't have to remember this random password. All we need to do is remember the password to get into this password database. All right, so the password for the password database should be sufficiently difficult so that it can safeguard all of your passwords. But the nice thing is that we don't have to worry about remembering all of these unique passwords. And some of those things we talked about, like uppercase, lowercase numbers, we can include in here or uninclude depending on if we check these boxes. Maybe we want to have special characters in here. We can also change the length to make things more difficult. And you can see that there is a quality meter that lets you know how difficult it might be to crack this password. All right, so we can save that and click OK. And then anytime we need this password, we can just come in here and click on it, and we see it copies it to the clipboard, and we can paste it in. Now additionally, there's also browser add-ons that you can use with password managers. There's plenty of other password managers out there as well, but essentially the workflow for a browser plugin would be, as long as the database is open and unlocked like this right now, if I go to a website, it will detect based on the URL that I put in here, and it will also detect username and password fields and pre-populate those for you. So that's a pretty nifty feature. Allows for you to create very complex passwords. Um, it's also good to create a unique password for each account that you have, because if one account gets compromised, you don't want a second account being compromised because you use the same password. All right, so I'd highly recommend you check out one of these. At least consider using a good strategy when you create your passwords. All right, so creating accounts, we can do this with GUI tools. We had seen in a previous lecture how we could look at the accounts that have been created, and it's essentially the same process. It's going to vary by distribution, but it usually boils down to searching for some sort of a settings type utility and then clicking on users. So an example here from OpenSUSE looks like this. They have users groups, some defaults and authentication settings, and we can see all of the users that are configured on this system. And if we wanted to add one, we would just click add and pretty much fill out the wizard window, and it would go out and create that user for us. So there's an example of what the wizard window might look like. We can put in that full name, which we know goes into the comment field, username, password, and so on. Now, the options are a little bit more limited when we go through the GUI. So if we use the command line, we actually have a little bit more power and flexibility over what all fields we specify. So let's look at how we can create accounts from the shell. And we can do that using the user add command. So the user add command has all of these different options, and you can also get a hold of the options through the man page. So I recommend you go through and read through that, look at some of the other options that are available, because these are just a subset of them. And we can provide that comment, we can say where the home directory needs to go, the expiration dates and inactive dates, we can set the default group, we can put them in supplemental groups, create the home directory, any skeleton directory. So if there's files that we normally want to have included within a home directory, we can specify a skeleton directory and that will be copied over for us. And we can also specify the default shell, the UID, and so on. So let's look at an example of how we can use that. And to do that, let's actually jump over into Ubuntu. Okay, so I'm going to open up a terminal. And let's create a new user called Fred. So in its most simplest form, user add just requires the username that we would like to create. So user add Fred. Now notice here I get permission denied. We should know by now that that means that my user account does not have, permissions to create a user account. I can't lock the etc password file. So what I'm going to need to do is run this command with sudo or become root in order to run it. So I'm going to preface this command with sudo user add Fred. It's going to ask for my password, and now that account should be created. Now to verify that, we could look at the tail of the etc password file, and we can see that Fred is right here. So remember, this means that the password is stored in the etc shadow file. We have the UID, the GID, no comment, the home directory, no shell. Okay, so there was some stuff that was left out there. If we wanted to, we could specify some of these other fields using those command line arguments. So let's try a sudo user add -c Eve Smith. So we're going to put a comment in there, and we'll call this Eve. Now if we go back and look at the tail of etc password, we'll see that the comment field has been provided. So a common option you're going to want to provide is -m, because -m creates the home directory. And if we go look right now, we'll see that even though the home directory is specified for Eve and Fred, that directory does not exist. So we would actually need to create that ourselves and assign the correct permissions to it. However, if we wanted to, we could have the user add command do that for us. So sudo user add, and this time let's do David, and let's specify the option -m. So -m should create that directory for us, and if we do an ls, we can see that David has been created. Let's also do a tail on the password file, and we'll see that the David account does exist. Now at this point though, the password has not been set for any of these accounts. Okay, so if I try to log in as David, I'm going to have a problem. I'm not going to be able to. We could switch over to a VT and try that, and we could try any password, but they're all going to fail because right now there is no password for David. So let me go back. We could also verify that by looking at the Etsy shadow file and seeing that there was an exclamation mark in there. So we'll see sudo grep David out of the Etsy shadow file, and there's no password set for David. Okay, so after we create an account, we want to go ahead and set a password for that account so that the user can log in. So to do that, we're going to use the passwd command, and only the root user can create passwords for other users. So we need to preface that with sudo, and then we need to specify the user account that we would like to change the password on. Now remember, if we don't specify a user account, it's going to try to change our password, and that's not necessarily what we want to do. Or in this case, if we run sudo password, it's going to try to change the root user's password. Okay, but we want to change David's password, so let's give him one here. Now that that's been updated successfully, I should be able to switch back to my VT, and let's try to log in as David now. Awesome. So now I'm able to log in, I'm in the home directory, and we know that that is created. Great. Let me exit out of there, and let's come back. Alright, so there's several other examples in here, like setting an expiration, explicitly setting the UID value, and so on. So, or even specifying a different location for the home directory if we wanted to. So if you'd like, come in here, play with some of these different options, see how they work. Now, when it comes to modifying accounts, we should first check and see if anybody is still logged in. Because we typically don't want to modify an account when someone is logged in. We could be doing things like changing their home directory or changing groups that they're in or UID values, and things can just get messed up if we do that. So if we want to check and see who's logged in, we've figured out a couple neat ways that we could do that in a previous lecture. We can use who or the W command. And there's also this last command that will look through a specific file to determine who all or when accounts were last logged in. So we can see here that David was last logged in at 12:05, so 1 minute ago today. Who and W just reveals that I am the only user logged in. So if we wanted to, we could make changes to David and not have to worry about anything. Do realize though that we can modify an account when someone is still logged in. So to do that through the GUI tools, here's a screenshot again from OpenSUSE, and you can see we're looking at user data for Kevin, so we could just make the modifications here in these text boxes and click OK, and that would go out and save the fields in their respective files. Or in Ubuntu, we could go into Settings, User Accounts, and here's our user account, David. So we could, I guess first we need to unlock this. Great. We could come in here and change David's password if we wanted to, give him automatic login. Not really many things that we can do here with David. Here we can give him a nice cool picture. Okay, so we've already talked about how we can change passwords. I do want to point out here that when you see shell prompts listed in screenshots, you'll see some that start with the pound and then some that start with a $sign. And what that means is the $sign means that you're logged in as an unprivileged user. The pound means you're logged in as root. Okay, so in this example, this is root running password Kevin. When we did it, we were logged in as an unprivileged user, so we had the $sign, so I had to preface this with sudo. Other than that, the process is the same. This is just setting a password for Kevin, and we've already gone through and done that for David. So next, let's look at the user mod command. As you can expect, this one modifies a user account. Now here's some of the options available for user mod. We can append this user to certain groups. So we would use the -A, and we would use this with a capital G as well to specify the groups, unless we wanted it to just replace the groups that the user's in. We can change home directory, expiration date, comments. A lot of these are the exact same from user add, and that should make sense. They should be using the same options. Notice that -M is not for create directory. Here is for move the home directory. Okay, so before we get into deleting accounts, let's take a look at an example of modifying an account. And let's modify the UID for David. So we're going to use this -U. For some reason, we want to come in and change his UID to something else. Maybe we had deleted a previous user and we would like for him to take over their UID, which is associated with different file permissions on the file system. So let's clear this, and let's figure out what David's current UID is. So we can do that using the grep command. We're going to grep for David out of etc password, and we see that his UID is 1004. We could also figure that out by running ID and getting a little bit cleaner output here. Now, I want to modify that, so I'm going to do a user mod -U, and let's change this to 1005 for David. Now, I'll run into that same issue again where permissions denied, and that should clue us in immediately that we need to do this as root, that our user account does not have permissions to do it. And I wanted to show you a little shortcut here, because this is a very typical workflow where you're typing something in and oops, you should have been root. So you can run sudo !! And that's going to run the last command that you typed in as sudo. Okay, so a little shortcut there. We see that that runs sudo user mod -U 1005 David. Now if we run ID David, we see that David's UID has been updated. Now additionally, one more example here of a user modification, and this one's good if you ever want to add somebody to be an administrator later on. So right now we see that David is not in the sudo group, and we know that the sudo group is for all of our administrators. So let's modify David. Let's put his UID back to 1004, and I want to append to his supplemental groups. So -A is append, -G is a list of supplemental groups, and since we're appending, we're not going to take them out of any groups. And I want to append sudo to David's list of groups. And so I'll put David here, and we need to preface the whole thing with sudo. Now if we look at the ID for David, we can see that David is also in the sudo group. That should allow David to to log in here and run commands with sudo, and it does. Alright, so moving right along here, let's also look at how we can delete accounts. So as a systems administrator, when we go to delete an account, there's a few things that we're going to want to think about. One of them is user file preservation. So thinking in the context of a company here, if we fire or David leaves, then some of the files that David was working on are probably important to our company and we need to keep them around. So we don't want to just go and delete all of David's files because they could be important to us. So we need to either copy them somewhere or leave his home directory intact so that we can get access to those files. Additionally, there's this ID, UID and GID that's associated with David and is also the owner of the files that David has created. So we've seen that when we do the ls-l, who owns the file and what group owns the file. So when we delete David, what happens is that UID and GID sticks around, and we'll see an example of that here in a second. And the idea here is that we could hire someone into David's position, let's say George, and we could assign George David's UID and GID, and he would already have access to all of the files that David had, or that David was able to access. Alright, so like I said, we'll see an example of that here in a second. Let's first talk about how we can delete accounts. So if we want to delete an account, we could do it with the GUI. So following the same example here in OpenSUSE, we just essentially find the user account, click on it, and hit delete. In Ubuntu, the process is pretty much the same. We go and find in the settings our user accounts, unlock, and then once we've authenticated, then we can highlight an account and click this minus, and that will delete the account. It'll also ask us if we want to keep the files or not. Okay, so that kind of plays into that file preservation that we were just talking about. But what if we want to do it from the command line? Well, we can do that with the user del command. So this follows the same naming convention as the other commands, user add and user mod. So if we want to delete an account, we'll use user del. And if we want to delete the home directory and the mail spool, in case we're using that, we use this -r command. So -r will remove the home directory and mail spool. If the user's logged in, we won't be able to do that, but we can force it to happen by also supplying this F option. So that forces the removal of the home directory and the mail spool for the user Samantha in this case. Alright, so let's look at our example that we talked about with David. So what I want to do is I want to log in as David. So I'm logged in as David here. And let's say I create some super secret bank file. And maybe it contains our business's account balance. Who knows? Maybe we're doing really good. We have $1 million in the bank. Awesome. So this super secret bank file is owned by David, and the David group has permissions to it. And we haven't really talked about permissions yet, but this last area is for everyone else, and it only has permissions to read. So let's exit out of David. And as the administrator, I'm going to go ahead and delete David's account. So we'll preface that with sudo. Notice I'm not using the -r, so that's going to leave his home directory around. So now if I look in the etc password file, let's just tell it, well, let's grep it. Grep for David out of etc password. We see the David account is gone. And if I move to the home directories, I see that his home directory is still around. And if I look in here, do a long listing, we can see that it doesn't say David anymore. Instead, it just shows the UID. So that tells me that this account has been deleted. but this UID is still associated and the owner of this super secret bank file. Now, only the root user can come in and change ownership and permissions. So as an unprivileged user, like me right now, I can still read this file, okay? But it's read only. I'm not able to make modifications to it. So maybe if we had to, oops, spend some money here. Oh goodness. Okay, maybe we're down to $8,000. If I try to save this, it's not going to let me. Get out of there. There we go. Alright, so in that example we talked about if we added, if we added a new employee, George, and we wanted him to take over David's position and have access to that super secret bank file. Maybe we make him the owner of it now. So we can add a new account, user add, and we know that we can specify that UID right here, so 1004. And we won't mess with the GID right now, but we could if we wanted to. We could specify that. And we'll also create the home directory, and we'll call this George. Oops, I forgot to do sudo, so we'll use our little trick here. And I'd already walked through this example, so the George directory already exists. So that's alright. George should still be created. We can check and make sure by looking in the etc password file. And look at that. We see that George's UID is 1004. Now, coincidentally, his GID is also 1004 because that was the next available GID. If I had deleted George and created a few other accounts in between, then it wouldn't have worked out as nice as this. But it did. So let's go ahead and set a password for George. Awesome. And then let's log in as George. Cool, so now I'm logged in as George, I'm in my home directory. Let me go back to David's home directory, and we see that super secret bank file. Now look at who is the owner and the group owner. It's George, because his UID and GID is 1004, so now George can come in here and modify this as he sees fit, and there's no problems with it now. Great. Okay, so the last topic I want to talk about here is managing groups, and we can do this as we've seen with GUI tools. So here's an example from OpenSUSE using YAST. They have a groups tab so they can come in and add groups, edit groups, and delete groups. And it shows us the group name, group ID, and who's members of it. If we want to add a user to a group, then we could edit one and just check the members. We could change the group ID if we wanted to, change the vanity name of it, and even put a password on that group if we wanted to. What we're interested in though is how can we manage groups from the command line. So we can add a new group by using the group add command, and let's look at how we can do that here in Ubuntu. So let's say George and I are going to work on a project together, and we'll just call it Project X. So group add, we won't worry about specifying a GID, it'll just take the next one available, which I would assume is 1005. So group add, and let's call it Project X. To preface that with sudo, and that created a new group. We can see that in the etc groups file. So if I just cat out etc, it's the etc group file. Down here at the bottom is Project X, no password, 1005 is GID. Notice right now nobody is members of this group. Alright, so with the group add command, there are a few options that we could use. So I'll let you read through these and play around with them. But let's look at how we can add users to a group. So once the group is created, if we want to add a user to a group, then we'll use that user mod command with the -A for append and -G to specify a list of supplemental groups that we can add this user to. So in this example, we're doing a user mod on Rich, and we're adding him to the consultants group. And then if we look at the groups that Rich is a part of, we can see he's a part of users and consultants. So let's come over here and let's add myself and George to this Project X group. So to do so, we're going to need to run user mod as root, and we'll do an append in supplemental groups Project X for myself, and then let's do the same thing for George. And if we look at groups for me, we see that I'm in Project X, and if we look at groups for George, we see George is also in Project X. Additionally, we could verify that by looking at the tail of the Etsy group file, and we can see that Corey and George have been added as members of this Project X group. Okay, so lastly, if we ever wanted to modify a group, we could use group mod. And group mod, we just run it with no options. It'll show us the different options that are available and how we can use it. So we could change the GID, we could give it a new name. So just a quick example here. Let's say maybe Project X turned into a different project. Let's do a sudo group mod new name Project Y, and Project X is the group that we want to change. Now if I look at groups for myself, we can see that I'm in Project Y. Okay, so we changed the name that way. And then lastly, if we wanted to delete a group, it would be group del. So if we're done with that project and we don't need that group anymore, then we could just run sudo group del Project Y, and now that group is gone. If we look at the tail of Etsy group, we see that George is the last group and Project Y is now gone. And the groups that I'm in no longer specify Project Y. Alright, so that wraps it up for this lecture. I hope you guys enjoy the labs and exercises, and as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.